Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story from a time when winter was not an inconvenience, but a season that determined who would live to see spring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the winter of 1315, in a small village that lay several days' ride from the nearest English market town, the people of Frost Hollow prepared for a night that would test every skill their ancestors had passed down. The village did not appear on most maps. It consisted of fewer than 40 timber-framed houses, low to the ground, their walls woven from wattle and daub, their roofs thick with thatch, layered carefully to repel rain and snow. Surrounding the settlement were narrow strips of farmland divided according to the open field system, each family responsible for scattered plots rather than a single enclosed farm. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen sharply. The sun hung pale and distant behind a curtain of gray cloud. The villagers had already brought in the last of the winter firewood from the communal stack near the tree line. Wood was precious. In much of medieval England and northern Europe, forests had been thinned by centuries of clearing, and peasants did not own woodland freely. Rights to gather fallen branches were regulated by local lords. Every log carried into a cottage had been collected with permission or quietly taken from common land at risk of a fine. Inside one of the cottages, a man named Edwin worked methodically beside the hearth. He was not a lord or knight, but a villain, bound to the manor of Sir Geoffrey de Mowbray. Edwin's obligations included several days of labor each week on the lord's domain fields, especially during planting and harvest seasons. In winter, those duties lessened slightly, but survival became the primary labor. The cottage consisted of a single large room. The floor was packed earth, scattered with rushes that were replaced periodically to reduce dampness. At the center, slightly offset to allow smoke to rise through a simple opening in the roof, burned the hearth. Chimneys were rare in modest peasant homes before the later Middle Ages. Smoke filtered upward slowly, filling the upper air with a haze that preserved the thatch from insects, but also irritated the lungs. Edwin adjusted the iron pot suspended over the coals. Inside simmered a pottage of barley, dried peas, and small pieces of salted pork saved from the autumn slaughter. The slaughter had taken place in November, on the feast of St. Martin, when livestock that could not be sustained through winter was butchered. Without modern preservation, meat was salted heavily or smoked to extend its usefulness. Even so, by late winter, supplies often ran thin. His wife, Agnes, layered additional straw along the wall where their 2 children would sleep. Beds were not raised frames, but straw-filled sacks laid on wooden boards. Blankets were woven from coarse wool. Linen undergarments, worn beneath rough outer tunics, were washed infrequently during winter due to freezing water. The cold entered through every seam of the structure. Medieval peasants understood insulation through practice rather than theory. The thick thatch on the roof trapped air. The wattle and daub walls, a mixture of clay, straw, and manure, hardened into a surprisingly effective barrier against wind. Animal dung mixed into the plaster improved cohesion and limited cracking. Yet gaps formed over time. Agnes had spent part of the afternoon pressing fresh daub into a fissure near the door. As darkness settled, the village grew quiet. Livestock had been brought into byres attached to homes or into shared barns. In some cottages, animals occupied one end of the same structure as humans, separated by a low partition. The body heat of cows, sheep, and goats contributed significantly to indoor warmth. The arrangement was practical rather than sentimental. Survival demanded efficiency. The winter of 1315 marked the beginning of what historians would later call the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Relentless rains had plagued the previous summer. Crops rotted in fields before harvest. Grain yields fell drastically across much of northern Europe. Prices rose to levels unseen in decades. Chroniclers recorded scenes of hunger in cities and countryside alike. Frost Hollow felt these pressures intimately. Edwin removed a small wooden chest from under the bench near the wall. Inside lay their remaining grain stores, carefully measured in linen sacks. Barley, rye, and a small amount of wheat were counted weekly. Bread formed the staple of medieval diet, and its absence meant weakness. The village oven, a communal clay structure, had operated less frequently that winter. Fuel for baking was also scarce. Agnes portioned the pottage evenly into wooden bowls. No metal spoons existed in their home. Each person used a carved wooden implement, or at times thick slices of stale bread known as trenchers. The meal was eaten slowly. Conversation remained minimal. Outside, the wind strengthened, carrying fine snow that pressed against the walls. After eating, Edwin banked the fire. This technique involved covering hot embers with ash to preserve heat through the night. In the morning, the embers could be revived with dry tinder rather than struck anew from flint and steel, which conserved precious fuel. Fire-starting materials were not limitless. Tinder might include dried moss, scraps of cloth, or charred linen. The children lay down first. Agnes and Edwin remained awake longer. Night in winter lasted many hours, often 14 or more. Sleep patterns in medieval Europe were segmented. People commonly experienced a first sleep and a second sleep, waking in between for quiet tasks, prayer, or conversation. This rhythm aligned with the long darkness and limited artificial light. Beyond the cottage, the village reeve, an elected official among the peasants, made a final circuit to ensure no stray embers threatened communal safety. Fire posed constant risk. Thatched roofs ignited easily. In cold months, when hearths burned continuously, vigilance increased. Snow accumulated against doors and along the narrow track leading to the fields. The open field system left the land exposed, marked by low ridges formed by repeated plowing. These ridges trapped snow unevenly, creating drifts that would complicate early spring plowing. Inside, the air grew warmer near the hearth, but remained cold at floor level. Agnes wrapped additional wool around her shoulders. Wool production formed a significant part of England's medieval economy. Even peasants often spun yarn during winter evenings using drop spindles or simple spinning wheels, introduced gradually in the High Middle Ages. The thread might be woven into cloth for household use or sold in small quantities. Edwin finally lay beside his family, pulling a heavy blanket over them all. Shared body heat conserved warmth. The practice was common and practical. Privacy, as understood in later centuries, did not shape medieval domestic life. As the first sleep deepened, the fire's glow dimmed to a faint red. Outside, temperatures dropped further. Frost formed along the inner walls where moisture from breath condensed. Yet within the humble structure, techniques refined over generations maintained a fragile equilibrium between cold and life. Hours later, Edwin stirred. This interval between sleeps was expected. He rose quietly, checked the embers, and added a small piece of wood. He stepped outside briefly, breaking a thin crust of ice that had formed against the door. The sky was clear now, stars sharp above the dark silhouette of the forest. Cold air stung exposed skin immediately.
In the distance, wolves howled. Wolves still inhabited parts of England in the early 14th century, though they were increasingly rare in more settled regions. Livestock were vulnerable in harsh winters. Village men sometimes organized hunts when predation intensified. Edwin returned inside and knelt near the hearth. He recited a short prayer learned in Latin fragments from the parish priest. Religious observance structured medieval life. The church calendar defined time through feast days and fasts. Even in hunger, Fasting seasons were observed as closely as circumstances allowed. Agnes woke briefly. Together they reviewed the grain chest once more. Calculation occurred not in written ledgers but in memory. They estimated weeks remaining until spring planting. If the thaw came early and seeds survived, there remained hope. Morning approached slowly. Pale light filtered through a small shuttered window. The family rose before full dawn. Labor in winter did not cease entirely. Tools required repair. Nets for trapping rabbits in nearby hedgerows needed mending. Agnes would join other women later to share spinning tasks, exchanging small portions of stored food or news. When Edwin opened the door fully, snow reached nearly to the threshold. He cleared a narrow path with a wooden shovel, reinforced with iron along its edge. Breath formed clouds in the air. Across the village, other doors opened. Figures wrapped in cloaks stepped into the white landscape. The coldest nights were endured not through comfort, but through layered strategies: insulated architecture, communal cooperation, preservation of food, regulated fuel use, shared sleeping, and adherence to routines that minimized waste. These measures had evolved across centuries of trial and error. Written manuals did not guide them, experience did. By mid-morning, smoke rose from every cottage. The village well required breaking through a sheet of ice to draw water. In extreme winters, some communities melted snow for washing, though it required additional fuel. Cleanliness, while valued in certain contexts, yielded to practicality when resources thinned. Sir Geoffrey's steward arrived on horseback near noon, cloaked heavily in fur. He carried news from neighboring manors. Grain prices in the nearest market town had doubled. Several villages reported illness linked to malnutrition. The steward reminded Frost Hollow of upcoming obligations, a portion of remaining grain owed as rent in kind once roads became passable. The message settled heavily, but produced no visible outburst. Peasants understood hierarchy as fixed. Resistance was rare and dangerous. Survival depended on balancing compliance with quiet resilience. As the day continued, clouds returned. Another night approached, likely colder than the last. Preparations would repeat with small adjustments. Each evening demanded the same deliberate sequence of actions. Over weeks and months, this discipline preserved life where neglect would have invited death. Thus, the pattern of endurance defined winter in Frost Hollow. It was neither dramatic nor romantic. It consisted of measured movements, shared labor, and inherited knowledge applied without pause. The coldest nights did not defeat them quickly. They tested them slowly, hour by hour, through practices embedded in the fabric of medieval rural existence. The second night of heavy frost settled over Frost Hollow with a clarity that hardened every surface it touched. By late afternoon, the sky had emptied of clouds, leaving behind a brittle blue that signaled deeper cold. The villagers understood these signs without formal study. A clear sky in winter often meant that the Earth's warmth would escape quickly after sunset. Preparations began before the light had fully faded. Edwin joined 3 other men at the edge of the open fields. Snow had drifted into the long ridges formed by the previous year's plowing. Each ridge marked a strip assigned to a household, though ownership did not function in the modern sense. The land belonged ultimately to Sir Geoffrey, and the peasants held it in tenure, bound by labor services and dues. Even in winter, the men inspected the fields to judge the condition of the soil beneath the snow. Too much saturation from the previous year's relentless rain had already weakened the harvest. If spring thaw brought more flooding, seed might rot again. They carried wooden staffs tipped with iron. These were not weapons for battle, but tools for testing ground firmness. Edwin drove the tip through the snow and into the soil. The resistance felt solid, frozen several inches deep. This was both relief and concern. Frozen ground protected remaining root crops left in storage pits, but delayed early plowing. Timing in medieval agriculture determined yield. Plowed too soon and the soil clumped wetly. Plowed too late and growing season shortened. Beyond the fields lay common pasture, now silent and white. In warmer months, cattle grazed there under the watch of a village herdsman. Winter reduced movement. Most animals remained sheltered, fed on hay cut and dried the previous summer. Hay storage was critical. A failed hay harvest often meant livestock starvation before spring grass returned. The villagers had measured their hay carefully in autumn, stacking it high within timber barns raised slightly off the ground to reduce dampness. As dusk approached, the men returned to the cottages. Smoke rose in thin columns, immediately flattened by cold air. Inside his home, Edwin checked the roof thatch from within. Snow resting atop thatch could provide additional insulation, but excessive accumulation risked collapse. He used a wooden pole to gently push upward where weight felt uneven. Agnes prepared the evening meal with even greater restraint than the night before. The pottage contained more barley water and fewer peas. Salted pork was cut thinner. Medieval diets in winter leaned heavily on grains and legumes. Fresh vegetables were rare unless preserved as dried beans, onions braided and hung from rafters, or cabbage fermented in brine. Root vegetables such as turnips and parsnips survived in earthen clamps outside, buried beneath straw and soil to prevent freezing. The children had spent the afternoon twisting straw into tighter bundles for bedding. Straw mattresses compacted quickly, losing loft and warmth. Regular shaking and replenishing maintained some insulation against the cold earth floor. Agnes spread fresh rushes near the doorway where snowmelt sometimes seeped inside. Night fell decisively. The temperature dropped further than the previous evening. The family gathered close to the hearth. Edwin demonstrated to his son how to bank the fire more effectively. He explained that ash acted as a barrier, slowing oxygen flow and preserving coals. Such instruction ensured continuity of knowledge. Literacy rates among peasants were low, but oral transmission was precise and habitual. Outside, the reeve organized a rotation for night watch over the livestock barn. Reports from a neighboring manor had mentioned theft during famine conditions. Hunger drove some to risk severe punishment. Livestock represented concentrated wealth. A single cow provided milk, manure for fertilizing fields, and potential calves. Losing one animal could shift a family from subsistence to desperation. Edwin took the second watch. Near midnight, he left the warmth of the cottage, wrapping a woolen cloak secured with a simple bronze brooch. His boots were leather, stiffened by cold, lined with scraps of wool. He crossed the narrow path toward the communal barn. Snow creaked beneath each step, a sharp sound amplified by stillness. Inside the barn, breath from cattle formed a low mist. The animals shifted slowly, hooves scraping against packed straw. Edwin checked the wooden latch and examined the walls for gaps. Timber boards shrank in cold weather, widening seams. He pressed additional straw into one opening where wind entered. During his watch, he reflected on the previous summer. Rain had fallen without rhythm, soaking grain before harvest. Sheaves left to dry in fields had molded. Chroniclers in monasteries far from Frost Hollow recorded the same pattern across regions of England, France, and the Low Countries. Grain imports by sea had been attempted, but storms damaged ships. The interconnected economy of medieval Europe was fragile. When harvest failed across multiple regions simultaneously, scarcity multiplied. After an hour, Edwin was relieved by another villager. He returned home and lay down for his first sleep. The cold penetrated more sharply that night. Frost formed intricate patterns along the inside of the shuttered window. Agnes rose during the interval between sleeps and stirred the embers. She added a fragment of peat stored from autumn cutting in a nearby marsh. Peat burned slowly and produced steady heat, though its smoke was dense. In the early hours before dawn, the cold reached its peak. This was the most dangerous time. Body temperature naturally dropped during sleep. Without sufficient insulation, hypothermia could develop gradually. Medieval peasants mitigated this risk through layered clothing worn even in bed. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat. Wool outer layers retained warmth even when slightly damp.
Morning brought no relief. The sun appeared but offered little heat. Frost Hollow moved cautiously. The well was nearly frozen solid. Two men took turns striking the ice with iron tools until a small opening allowed water to be drawn. Buckets were carried quickly to prevent freezing before reaching Hearthside. Agnes joined other women in a neighboring cottage to spin wool. The gathering served multiple purposes. Shared indoor space conserved fuel, and collective spinning increased productivity. Wool thread would later be woven on a loom owned by one family but used cooperatively. Cloth production supplemented agricultural income, especially in regions tied to the broader wool trade that connected England to Flemish textile centers. Conversation during spinning focused on practical matters: how much grain remained, which families required assistance, and rumors of relief from the manor lord. The church sometimes organized almsgiving during famine years, though resources were limited. Monasteries with larger stores occasionally distributed grain, but distance and transport posed obstacles. By midday, Sir Geoffrey himself rode into the village accompanied by two retainers. His arrival was formal but measured. He inspected the barns and inquired about seed reserves for spring planting. Though bound by feudal hierarchy, lord and peasants shared dependence on agricultural recovery. If tenants perished or abandoned holdings, the manor's productivity declined. Sir Geoffrey announced a temporary reduction in certain labor obligations, allowing peasants more time to secure their own provisions. Such decisions were pragmatic. Surviving tenants ensured future rents. He also warned that hunting deer in the nearby forest remained prohibited. Deer were reserved for the lord's table under forest law, and poaching carried severe penalties. The visit concluded without ceremony. The retainer's horses left deep impressions in the snow. Edwin observed the animals' condition closely. Horses required substantial fodder. Their survival suggested that the manor's stores, while strained, had not yet collapsed. As evening approached once more, wind returned from the north. Clouds thickened. Snow began to fall in fine, persistent flakes. The villagers repeated their rituals with increasing efficiency. Firewood stacks were assessed again. Edwin calculated that at current consumption rates, their supply might last 6 more weeks. Spring planting ideally began in March, depending on thaw. That night, as the storm intensified, snow piled against the cottage walls. The sound of wind through thatch created a constant low hum. Inside, the family lay close together. Agnes placed a warmed stone wrapped in cloth near the children's feet. Stones heated by the hearth and transferred carefully to bedding provided localized warmth for several hours. Beyond the cottages, the open fields disappeared underneath an unbroken white expanse. Boundaries between strips blurred. The physical markers of medieval land tenure vanished temporarily, concealed by winter's uniform layer. Yet beneath the snow, seeds of future survival waited, contingent on timing, weather, and endurance. The coldest nights were cumulative. Each one consumed fuel, food, and physical strength. Yet they also reinforced systems refined over centuries: communal watch rotations, shared labor indoors, careful rationing, architectural adaptation, and acceptance of seasonal rhythms. No single technique ensured safety. Emergence came from their combination, applied consistently without deviation.
By the third week of relentless frost, the routines of Frost Hollow had hardened into something almost mechanical. Each task was performed without hesitation, each ration measured without discussion. Winter no longer felt temporary, it felt structural, as if the cold had become a fixed condition of the world. The snow that had once fallen in soft layers was now compacted into dense ridges along the paths between cottages. Foot traffic had created narrow corridors bordered by hardened white. The open fields remained sealed beneath ice-bound soil. No plow could break it, no seed could enter it. The village existed in suspension. Edwin rose before dawn, as he had every day since boyhood. The fire's embers still glowed faintly beneath ash. He coaxed them to life with dried moss and splinters shaved from a larger log. Sparks caught slowly. Fuel had to be fed with patience. A single careless addition could waste precious wood. Agnes measured barley into a small hand mill set near the wall. The quernstone turned with steady pressure. Grinding grain by hand required strength and endurance. Over months, the repetitive motion shaped muscle and wore grooves into stone. Flour fell into a wooden bowl below. The sound of grinding filled the room in a low rhythm that had marked winter mornings for generations. Their son, Thomas, now assisted in the task. At 10 years old, he was considered capable of contributing fully to household labor. Childhood in Frost Hollow was defined by participation rather than separation. Skills were introduced early because delay carried risk. The resulting coarse flour would be mixed with water and a small amount of sourdough starter preserved from previous batches. Yeast as a cultivated concept did not exist. Fermentation relied on naturally occurring organisms captured and maintained in the dough. The bread baked that day would be dense and dark, reflecting the high proportion of barley and rye. Wheat was scarce and reserved for obligations to the manor or for rare feast days. Outside, a different sound moved through the village. A cart approached along the frozen road from the direction of the market town. The wheels creaked sharply in the cold. 2 men accompanied it, both wrapped heavily in cloaks bearing the insignia of a nearby abbey. Word traveled quickly. The monks had arrived. The abbey lay nearly 15 miles away, but monastic communities often served as centers of limited relief during famine. Their lands were sometimes better managed, their storage facilities more substantial. The cart carried sacks of grain and several small barrels. The village gathered without ceremony. The monks spoke briefly with the reeve and then with Sir Geoffrey's steward, who had returned to oversee distribution. The grain was not charity in abundance. It was measured, calculated to extend survival rather than eliminate hunger. Each household received a modest portion of oats and a small quantity of salted fish preserved in brine. Salted fish formed a significant component of medieval winter diet, particularly during fasting periods when meat was restricted. Herring and cod traveled long distances through trade networks linking the North Sea and Baltic regions to inland communities. Even a small barrel represented complex exchange systems operating despite regional hardship. Edwin carried his portion home carefully. The additional grain slightly altered their calculations. Agnes adjusted the household schedule for the coming weeks. Instead of thinning the pottage further, she restored a more balanced mix of legumes and grain. The fish would be used sparingly, added to meals to increase protein without immediate depletion. As day progressed, clouds gathered once more. The wind carried a sharper edge than before. Reports from the monks described conditions beyond Frost Hollow. Several villages closer to the coast had experienced total crop failure. Livestock deaths had increased due to insufficient fodder. In some towns, bread prices had tripled again. The information did not provoke visible reaction. It confirmed what the villagers already sensed. The famine extended beyond their immediate horizon. This knowledge reinforced caution. No external abundance would arrive quickly. That evening, Edwin inspected the earthen clamp where turnips were stored. He dug carefully through layers of straw and soil. The outermost vegetables had frozen and softened, unusable now. Deeper inside, several remained firm. He removed only what was necessary, resealing the pit to protect the rest. Root storage techniques were ancient and widespread. By insulating crops underground, peasants created stable microclimates that reduced temperature fluctuation. Yet prolonged severe frost could penetrate even these measures. Each retrieval became an assessment of how much winter still lay ahead. Inside the cottage, Agnes prepared a stew incorporating the salted fish. She soaked it first to reduce excess salt, then added it to barley and sliced turnips. The aroma differed from previous nights, carrying a faint trace of the sea despite the village's inland isolation. After the meal, Edwin repaired a wooden plowshare stored against the wall. The iron tip had been removed and hung separately to prevent rust. He inspected it for cracks. Plows in this region were heavy moldboard designs, capable of turning dense soil. They required teams of oxen to pull. Maintaining equipment during winter ensured readiness once thaw arrived.
As darkness settled, wind intensified rapidly. Snow did not fall this time. Instead, air itself seemed to freeze, the kind of cold that carried no moisture but extracted warmth from exposed skin in moments. Doors were sealed with additional cloth along the base. Agnes pressed wool into gaps around the shutter. The night watch rotation expanded. Reports of theft from a neighboring manor had grown more frequent. Hunger pushed boundaries. Edwin took his turn again near the livestock barn. This time, frost coated the interior beams. The animals shifted restlessly, their breath forming thicker clouds. During his watch, he heard movement beyond the outer fence, not the steady step of a villager, but irregular crunching through snow. He held still. After several moments, a thin figure emerged near the edge of the clearing. It was a boy, older than Thomas, perhaps 14, dressed in torn garments unsuitable for such cold. The boy did not approach the barn directly. He lingered near the fence, watching. Edwin stepped forward slowly, keeping his voice low. The boy spoke first, identifying himself as from a village 2 days' walk east. Their stores had failed entirely. He sought food. Edwin understood the risk. Bringing an outsider into the barn could endanger livestock, yet leaving him outside guaranteed death. The balance between communal protection and human survival stood stark in such moments. He led the boy toward the Reeves cottage instead. There, after brief discussion among several elders, a decision was made. The boy would be given a small portion of grain and directed toward the Addy where relief might continue. He would not remain in Frost Hollow. The village's resources could not sustain additional mouths. The exchange was direct and measured. The boy accepted the grain without expression and departed before dawn. Edwin returned home as the first gray light appeared. That day, the cold persisted with little variation. Agnes adjusted the household schedule slightly. She began melting small quantities of snow for washing utensils rather than drawing exclusively from the well, conserving effort as ice thickened. The children were tasked with collecting any fallen twigs along the tree line, careful not to trespass beyond permitted woodland. In the afternoon, the parish priest visited each household briefly, offering blessings and reminding villagers of upcoming feast days despite hardship. Religious structure provided continuity. The liturgical calendar moved forward even when agricultural time seemed paused. As night approached again, the air grew still. No wind moved. Such stillness often preceded extreme temperature drops. Edwin reinforced the door latch and stacked additional ash near the hearth to bank embers more heavily than usual. When the family laid down, they wore extra layers. Agnes placed 2 warmed stones this time, one near the children's feet and another wrapped carefully near the side of the bedding. Breath condensed thickly in the dim light. Midnight passed in silence. The cold reached an intensity that slowed even the crackle of the hearth. Outside, the snow surface hardened into a crust. The world felt sealed. Yet inside the cottage, life continued in measured rhythms. Breath, ember glow, wool against skin, straw beneath linen. These were the mechanisms that allowed medieval peasants to endure the coldest nights. Not dramatic acts, but layered, deliberate habits reinforced daily. By dawn, frost etched the interior walls once more. The family rose slowly, conserving movement. The fire was revived carefully. Another day began in identical form to the last. Winter had not broken them. Hunger had not overtaken them. The systems of storage, cooperation, limited relief, and disciplined rationing held firm for now. Frost Hollow remained standing within a wider landscape strained by famine and cold. The season had not yet reached its turning point, but through repetition and restraint, the village continued forward, one measured night at a time.
By early February, the cold had reshaped the land into something rigid and unrecognizable. The open fields of Frost Hollow, once marked by curved ridges and narrow boundary paths, had become a single unbroken sheet of white and iron gray. Fences were half buried. The shallow stream beyond the pasture had frozen solid enough to support a man's weight. The village moved across it now instead of around it, shortening distances while the thaw remained far away. The turning of the year approached according to the church calendar, though little in the landscape suggested renewal. Candlemas had passed, marking the traditional midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox. In ordinary years, it carried the faint promise that daylight would lengthen enough to matter. This year, light returned slowly but brought no warmth. Inside Edwin's cottage, the grain chest was opened again. Agnes counted remaining measures with care, shaped by weeks of discipline. The addition from the abbey had extended their supply, but not comfortably. The salted fish barrel was nearly empty. Turnips from the earthen clamp had softened further. Several more were lost to deep frost. Each loss narrowed margin. Thomas and his younger sister, Ellen, no longer asked for larger portions at meals. Hunger had settled into a constant but manageable presence, dull rather than sharp. Their bodies adjusted to smaller rations, conserving energy through reduced movement. Winter demanded stillness. Outside, Sir Geoffrey's steward returned with new instructions. Word had come from the Shire that certain levies would be delayed due to widespread hardship. Royal demands did not disappear, but collection would wait until roads reopened. Such adjustments were rare and reflected the scale of distress across the realm. The Great Famine was not confined to isolated villages. It stretched from Ireland through England and into continental Europe, driven by consecutive years of failed harvests and abnormal weather patterns that modern historians associate with climatic shifts at the onset of the so-called Little Ice Age. Edwin listened without visible reaction. Political decisions were distant forces, acknowledged but not debated. What mattered was immediate survival. That afternoon, he joined several men to inspect the oxen more closely. Oxen were essential for spring plowing. Unlike horses, they required less expensive fodder and were more durable in harsh conditions, though slower. The animals' ribs showed faintly beneath their hides now. Hay stores had been rationed carefully, but winter length strained even prudent planning. One ox coughed intermittently, a sign of cold stress or respiratory infection from damp air within the barn. The men adjusted bedding, adding extra straw beneath the animal to insulate it from frozen ground. They checked hooves for cracks caused by prolonged exposure to ice. Loss of even one ox would complicate plowing schedules significantly. Inside the barn, warmth from animal bodies still created a noticeable difference compared to the open air. The combined heat of livestock remained a central strategy in surviving the coldest nights. In some cottages at the edge of Frost Hollow, goats were kept within the same structure as the family during extreme cold, separated by wooden partitions but sharing roof and warmth. The arrangement conserved fuel and reduced risk of animals freezing. As evening approached, clouds gathered again, though without snow. The sky held a metallic sheen. Agnes prepared pottage thinner than earlier weeks, but fortified with a small portion of dried beans saved carefully since autumn. Beans provided protein and sustained strength better than grain alone. She had soaked them overnight to soften their hardness, a practice passed down from her mother. After eating, Edwin sat near the doorway repairing a fishing net. Though the stream was frozen now, once thaw arrived, fish would supplement diet quickly. Medieval peasants relied on seasonal diversity: fish in spring, fresh greens and herbs soon after, then early grains by late summer. The winter famine represented a narrowing of this diversity to its most basic elements. Later that night, the temperature dropped sharply once more. Wind returned from the east, carrying air so dry that exposed skin cracked. Agnes applied rendered animal fat lightly to the children's hands to prevent splitting. Such simple measures reduced infection risk. Medical knowledge in Frost Hollow was practical rather than theoretical. Herbal remedies hung from rafters: dried yarrow for wounds, chamomile for calming, garlic for general strength. None could counter famine directly, but they supported endurance. Near midnight, a loud crack echoed across the village. Several men emerged with lanterns shielded by horn panels. The sound had come from the direction of the frozen stream. Upon inspection, they found a section of ice had fractured under internal pressure, though no one had been crossing at the time. Temperature fluctuations caused expansion and contraction.
The break served as a reminder that even frozen surfaces were not entirely stable. The following morning brought an unfamiliar sight, a thin band of pale sunlight that lingered slightly longer along the southern edge of the sky. Daylight was increasing, though imperceptibly at first. The knowledge mattered more than the warmth it failed to deliver. Agnes reorganized the household interior to maximize efficiency. She shifted bedding slightly closer to the hearth, though careful to avoid stray sparks. She patched a woolen cloak with thread spun weeks earlier. Cloth repair extended garment life beyond what modern expectation might assume. A single cloak often served for years, patched repeatedly until fabric itself weakened irreparably. In the afternoon, the parish priest called the villagers together within the small wooden church at the village edge. The building was simple: timber frame, narrow windows, and a stone altar. Inside, air was scarcely warmer than outside, but gatherings served social cohesion. The priest read from scripture in Latin, then explained briefly in the vernacular. He emphasized endurance, charity where possible, and preparation for Lent, which approached soon. Lent would impose dietary restrictions on meat and dairy. For Frost Hollow, these restrictions overlapped with scarcity already imposed by winter. The difference lay in structure. Fasting during Lent followed prescribed rhythm rather than necessity alone. The villagers observed it as faithfully as conditions allowed. That night marked one of the coldest recorded by memory in the village. Frost formed even on interior beams above the hearth where smoke typically prevented ice accumulation. Edwin increased the ash layer over embers more thickly than ever before, preserving maximum heat. Agnes positioned all bedding tightly together, minimizing exposed surface area. Sleep came in segments, lighter than usual due to the penetrating cold. In the interval between first and second sleep, Edwin rose to check the ox that had been coughing. He moved through the still darkness toward the barn. Inside, the animal stood but appeared weaker. Edwin placed his hand against its flank. The warmth remained, though less vigorous. He added additional straw and adjusted the animal's covering of rough wool cloth secured over its back. Livestock were sometimes blanketed during extreme cold when materials allowed. Such care reflected recognition that animal survival equaled human survival. By dawn, the ox remained alive, though diminished. The village breathed a collective but silent acknowledgement of relief. Loss had been avoided for another day.
As weeks progressed, minor signs of change began appearing despite continued frost. Icicles formed along thatch edges, then lengthened, suggesting slight daytime melting. Snow crust softened marginally under afternoon sun before refreezing at night. These small cycles hinted at transition. Edwin began sharpening plow irons more deliberately. The sound of metal against stone carried through the crisp air. Other men did the same. Preparation for spring could not wait for full thaw. Tools must be ready the moment soil yielded. Agnes counted seeds reserved for planting. Seed grain had been protected separately from food grain since autumn. To consume seed would ensure immediate survival but guarantee future failure. The discipline to preserve it marked a defining feature of medieval subsistence strategy. That boundary was not crossed unless absolute desperation forced it. One evening, as light lingered slightly longer, Thomas stepped outside and noticed a faint dripping from the barn roof. Meltwater fell in slow intervals. The sound was small but distinct against winter silence. Inside the cottage that night, the family lay beneath wool and straw as before. The cold remained severe, but its character had shifted subtly. It no longer felt endless. It felt strained, as if held together by diminishing force. Frost Hollow had endured the deepest portion of winter through structure rather than comfort. Layered insulation, rationed grain, preserved seed, communal vigilance, livestock integration, and adherence to seasonal rhythms shaped by both agriculture and faith. Hunger had pressed close but not overtaken them. The land remained locked, yet slight signals of release began to appear. The turning of the year did not arrive with sudden warmth. It came gradually, almost imperceptibly through longer light, softer snow, and the disciplined patience of those who understood that survival required waiting as much as action. The coldest nights still lingered, but their dominance was weakening. Beneath the frozen fields of Frost Hollow, the next chapter of endurance prepared quietly to begin.
By late February, the character of winter began to fracture. The cold did not vanish, but it loosened its grip in uneven intervals. Days brought brief softness to the snow's surface, followed by nights that refroze everything into ridged glass. Frost Hollow entered the most uncertain phase of the season, when survival depended not only on enduring cold, but on navigating transition. The first true thaw began with a steady southern wind that carried dampness instead of dryness. Snow along cottage walls shrank visibly, exposing the lower timber beams darkened by months of contact. Water dripped steadily from thatched roofs, forming shallow channels through the packed pathways. The sound of melting replaced the silence that had defined the deep freeze. Edwin rose before dawn as always, but this time the air inside the cottage felt different. The hearth still required careful tending, yet frost no longer formed as thickly along the interior walls. Agnes opened the shutter slightly to allow smoke to escape more freely. A faint scent of wet earth drifted in. The opened fields began revealing their contours again. Snow retreated first from the higher ridges where wind had scoured it thin. Dark strips of soil emerged like scars across the white expanse. The ground beneath remained frozen several inches down, but the surface softened during daylight. This period carried new risks. Meltwater pooled unpredictably, saturating low-lying strips. The previous year's heavy rains had already weakened drainage patterns. If soil remained too wet when plowing began, oxen would struggle, and seeds might rot as before. Sir Geoffrey rode through the village once more, this time with more visible urgency. He gathered the reeve and several experienced plowmen, including Edwin, near the manor's outer boundary. The lord's concern was practical. The manor's survival depended on timely planting. He instructed them to test multiple strips across different elevations over the coming days. Testing soil required judgment refined through experience. Edwin carried the iron-tipped staff again, driving it into newly exposed ground. The top layer yielded slightly, but beneath it resistance remained firm. Plowing too early would damage both soil structure and oxen strength. Patience remained necessary, though food stores were nearly exhausted. Inside the cottage, Agnes reviewed the seed grain once more. She had preserved separate sacks of barley, oats, and a smaller measure of rye. Each kernel represented future bread. The temptation to use seed for immediate meals lingered faintly, but discipline held. Generations had taught that survival extended beyond present hunger. The ox that had weakened during the coldest nights now showed cautious improvement. Exposure to sunlight and slightly warmer air revived its appetite. Edwin supplemented its ration with the last of the better hay reserved for breeding stock. Protecting plow animals remained priority. As thaw progressed, the frozen stream cracked fully open. Sheets of ice broke apart and drifted slowly downstream. Children watched from a safe distance. The sound of moving water returned to the valley, steady and persistent. With melting came mud. Paths between cottages turned slick and uneven. Cartwheels would soon carve deep ruts if travel resumed too quickly. The reeve organized communal labor to lay brush and straw along the most trafficked sections, preventing wagons from sinking when market trips resumed. Food stores thinned visibly now. The grain chest in Edwin's cottage held only enough for perhaps 10 days at current ration. Agnes reduced portions slightly again, balancing immediate strength with seed preservation. Pottage became almost entirely grain water thickened just enough to satisfy hunger. One afternoon,
A messenger arrived from the abbey with sobering news. Relief supplies were nearly depleted. Monastic stores had been distributed widely, and new harvests were months away. Frost Hollow could expect no further aid. The message confirmed what they already sensed. Survival from this point forward rested entirely on their own preparation and the timing of spring. By early March, daylight extended noticeably. The sun lingered long enough to soften soil on south-facing strips. Edwin and the other plowmen assembled oxen teams and attempted the first shallow furrow. The plow blades scraped unevenly at first, striking frozen patches, but eventually cut a narrow line through softened earth. The sight of turned soil after months of white brought quiet recognition. No celebration followed. The work intensified immediately. Plowing required coordination between driver and oxen. Commands were simple, repeated in steady tones. The heavy moldboard plow flipped soil to create raised ridges for drainage. In waterlogged years, these ridges prevented seed from drowning. Given the previous summer's disaster, they were shaped carefully. Agnes and other women followed days later to broadcast seed by hand once sufficient strips were prepared. Seed distribution demanded even rhythm. Too dense and plants would compete weakly. Too sparse and yield would drop. Knowledge of spacing existed in muscle memory rather than written guide. Children assisted by scaring birds from newly sown strips. Birds, equally hungry after winter, descended quickly. Simple wooden clappers and shouted noise kept them at distance during the most vulnerable days. Evenings remained cold. Frost returned nightly, hardening freshly turned soil. The alternation between thaw and freeze created a crumbly texture beneficial for seed coverage, though excessive freeze risked lifting seedlings later. Food at home grew scarce enough that Agnes prepared the final measure of stored beans. She combined them with ground oats into a dense mash baked near the hearth. The meal was minimal but sustaining. Edwin calculated days remaining until early greens might emerge along hedgerows. Nettles, wild garlic, and sorrel. These would supplement diet before grain matured. By mid-March, green hints appeared faintly at field edges. Nettles pushed through damp soil, resilient and early. Agnes gathered them carefully, wearing cloth around her hands to avoid stings. Boiled into broth, they provided vital nutrients absent from winter rations. Such foraging marked the bridge between scarcity and renewal. The oxen, though thinner than autumn, maintained enough strength to complete initial plowing. No animal had been lost. This alone distinguished Frost Hollow from neighboring reports where entire teams had perished. As Lent began, fasting practices blended seamlessly with necessity. Meat remained scarce regardless. The parish priest reminded villagers of spiritual discipline aligning with seasonal hunger. The convergence reinforced endurance rather than diminishing it. One evening, rain fell for the first time since deep winter. Not snow, but cold, steady rain. It soaked into newly turned soil. The village watched carefully. Too much rain would repeat disaster, but this rainfall remained moderate, absorbed without pooling excessively. By late March, the grain chest in Edwin's cottage stood empty of food grain. Only seed remained, carefully tied and untouched. Meals now relied primarily on gathered greens, remaining turnips salvaged from the clamp, and thin oat gurley. Hunger sharpened briefly again, but hope accompanied it. Seeded strips began showing faint lines of green within weeks. The first barley shoots emerged, fragile but upright. The site confirmed that soil conditions had been sufficient. The open fields, once buried and silent, now displayed ordered rows of early growth. The survival of Frost Hollow through the coldest nights and leanest weeks had depended on layered knowledge. Architecture adapted to retain warmth, livestock integrated into living spaces, communal watch systems, disciplined rationing, preservation of seed, cooperation with monastic relief, careful timing of plowing, and foraging expertise bridging winter and spring. No single event marked their endurance. It unfolded through continuous adjustment, restraint, and coordination across households. The famine was not yet fully ended. Harvest remained months away and risk persisted. But the most dangerous stretch, The deep freeze when stores dwindled and soil lay sealed had passed. As evening settled on a damp March day, Edwin stood at the edge of his strip, watching small green shoots align across the field. Behind him, smoke rose lightly from cottages no longer sealed tight against lethal cold. The air carried scent of wet earth rather than frozen wood. Inside the cottage, Agnes prepared a broth of nettles and the final slivers of salted fish preserved carefully for this moment of transition. The children ate slowly, strength returning in small increments. Winter had tested Frost Hollow without spectacle. It had pressed steadily, reduced options, and exposed limits. Yet through deliberate systems shaped by generations, the village endured the coldest nights and emerged into fragile renewal. The reckoning of winter had concluded not in triumph, but in continuation. The land, once locked beneath ice, now opened cautiously. Survival shifted from endurance to cultivation, from guarding embers to nurturing seedlings. And in that measured shift, the story of medieval peasants surviving the coldest nights carried forward into the labor of spring.
By early April, the fields around Frost Hollow showed thin lines of green stretching across the ridges that had been turned weeks before. Barley rose first, pale and narrow. Oats followed more slowly. The soil remained heavy in places, dark with retained moisture from thaw and early rain. Every step across it required caution. Too much pressure could compress the young growth and damage the fragile roots. The villagers moved with deliberate restraint across the fields. Plow teams were redirected to strips not yet prepared, while seeded land was avoided except where necessary. Oxen leaned into their harnesses, muscles still recovering from winter scarcity. Their ribs remained visible beneath coarse hides, but strength had returned enough to complete the essential work. Inside Edwin's cottage, hunger remained present. The grain chest now held only seed for later plantings, and a small reserve Agnes refused to touch except in absolute emergency. Meals depended heavily on gathered greens. Nettles were boiled daily. Wild garlic leaves were chopped into thin broth. Sorrel added sharpness to otherwise plain mixtures. These plants, rich in nutrients, had sustained medieval populations for centuries during the lean gap between winter stores and summer abundance. This period, often called the hungry months, was historically one of the most dangerous phases of the agricultural year. Even in normal cycles, stored grain frequently ran out weeks before new crops matured. In famine years like 1315, the gap widened. Frost Hollow had preserved enough seed to plant, but little remained for immediate comfort. Thomas and Elin joined other children along hedgerows, searching for edible shoots and bird eggs where nests could be found safely. They carried small woven baskets and moved carefully through damp undergrowth. Their labor was neither play nor novelty. It was structured contribution to household survival. Rain returned in steady intervals, not the relentless crop-rotting downpour of the previous summer, but moderate showers that alternated with weak sunlight. The villagers watched the sky constantly. Weather had become an adversary in the previous year. Now it was evaluated daily as potential ally or threat. Sir Geoffrey's steward rode out regularly to assess crop development across the manor lands. Reports from other villages suggested uneven recovery. Some areas experienced renewed flooding where drainage failed. Frost Hollow's ridged fields, shaped carefully during plowing, allowed water to settle between raised rows rather than over seedlings. The technique, inherited through generations, proved essential. Inside the livestock barn, calves born late in winter began to stand steadily. Their arrival marked fragile optimism. Milk production increased slightly as pasture grasses strengthened. Agnes diluted milk into broths, extending nourishment for the children. Butter and cheese production remained minimal until herds could graze freely. Firewood use decreased as nights grew milder. The hearth was still central to daily life, but fuel was conserved for cooking rather than constant heating. Smoke no longer lingered as thickly beneath the thatch. Windows were opened briefly during midday to air out damp interiors accumulated over months of sealed living. Repair work intensified across the village. Thatch damaged by snow weight was replaced. Daub cracked by freeze-thaw cycles was patched with fresh mixtures of clay, straw, and manure. Tools worn during plowing were sharpened again.
Medieval peasants understood maintenance as continuous rather than occasional. Failure to repair promptly could cascade into greater loss later. One afternoon, a trader from the market town arrived with a small cart carrying coarse salt and iron nails. Trade had resumed cautiously as roads dried. Prices remained high, but small exchanges became possible again. Edwin traded a woolen skein Agnes had spun during winter for a handful of nails needed to secure barn planks loosened by frost. The presence of trade signaled broader stabilization. The famine had not ended across the realm, but movement and exchange slowly resumed. News carried by traders spoke of continued hardship in northern regions, yet southern shires showed cautious improvement. By late April, barley shoots thickened visibly. The green deepened in color, covering fields that had been white only weeks earlier. Oats followed, though thinner. Rye strips lagged, but remained viable. Each day without heavy storm increased confidence. Hunger, however, did not disappear instantly. Stored food was gone. New grain was months from harvest. Agnes began stretching meals with small portions of dried peas reserved from seed overflow. She balanced carefully between consumption and future planting. The parish priest organized rogation processions around the fields in early May, following tradition meant to bless crops and protect against blight. Villagers walked the boundaries of their strips, reciting prayers in Latin and vernacular. These rituals reinforced communal identity and agricultural focus. They also physically marked field edges after winter's erasure. Edwin walked the boundary of his assigned strips with Thomas beside him. He pointed out the subtle curvature of ridges, explaining how water must flow away from roots. He described the disaster of the previous year when rain drowned seedlings before maturity. Instruction continued even in scarcity. Knowledge transfer could not wait for comfort. As May advanced, early pasture grasses strengthened enough to release cattle for limited grazing during daylight. The sight of animals outside barns lifted the practical burden of fodder distribution. Oxen moved stiffly at first, then more confidently. Their manure, now deposited directly onto fields, would enrich soil naturally. Agnes churned a small quantity of butter from surplus milk one morning, the first since autumn. The amount was modest, but it marked a shift. Fat, absent for months except in thin slivers of salted pork, returned to the diet in measured form. Inside the cottage, sleeping arrangements changed slightly. Bedding was spread with more space as nights warmed. The family no longer required tightly shared body heat. Windows remained open longer during daylight, allowing interior dampness to dry fully. By early June, the barley stood knee-high. The color of the fields transformed from tentative green to dense growth that swayed under moderate wind. Risk persisted. Hail, disease, excessive rain could still undo progress, but the worst vulnerability had passed. The lean spring gradually loosened its hold. Meals incorporated fresh curds, early herbs, and thicker broths. Strength returned slowly to the children's faces. Edwin felt weight returning to his limbs as diet improved incrementally. Throughout this period, the memory of winter remained present but unspoken. The coldest nights were not dramatic singular events. They were extended sequences of disciplined endurance, structured cooperation, and careful calculation. Their survival depended on architecture, livestock integration, rationing systems, seed preservation, field design, and communal governance. Now, as fields matured under longer daylight, Frost Hollow entered a phase defined not by survival alone, but by cautious rebuilding. Tools were repaired for upcoming hay harvest. Barn spaces were reorganized to prepare for grain storage months ahead. Lessons from the famine were already shaping decisions. Additional drainage channels dug along lower strips, hay meadows inspected with greater scrutiny, seed reserves expanded where possible. Summer would bring its own labor and uncertainty. Harvest would determine whether the famine's grip finally released its hold across the region. But as Part 6 closes, Frost Hollow stands no longer in the grip of lethal frost. The coldest nights have passed into memory, replaced by the steady demands of growth. The village that endured ice, hunger, and silence now moves forward under open sky, its survival carried not by fortune alone, but by layered knowledge refined over generations of confronting winter at its harshest edge.
By June's end, the fields around Frost Hollow had transformed completely. Where snow once buried the ridges and ice sealed the earth, Barley now rippled in long green waves that reached nearly to Edwin's waist. Oats shimmered slightly lighter in color, bending more easily beneath the wind. Rye stood darker and taller along the higher strips where drainage proved strongest. Summer did not bring rest, it brought urgency of a different kind. The famine years had taught the villagers that survival did not end with spring planting. A failed harvest in summer would return them to the edge of winter's hunger once again. Every stalk of grain now carried the weight of memory from the coldest nights. Edwin rose earlier than during winter, waking before full sunrise to take advantage of cooler morning hours. The oxen were stronger now, having grazed steadily for weeks. Their ribs no longer showed sharply, and their movement had regained steadiness. They were redirected from plowing to hauling stones removed from fields during spring thaw. Clearing stones improved both drainage and blade movement during harvest. Agnes shifted her labor outdoors more frequently. She joined other women in weeding between grain rows where growth had been uneven. Weeds competed aggressively in soil enriched by spring moisture. Pulling them by hand required patience and precision. Metal tools were limited. Most weeding relied on fingers and small wooden implements. The children were tasked with guarding fields from birds again. This time the threat was more substantial. Flocks descended in coordinated movements, targeting ripening heads. Thomas stood on a small raised platform constructed from spare timber, shaking a rattle made of dried seed pods tied to cord. The repetitive motion and sound discouraged large gatherings. Haymaking began in early July. Meadows beyond the main grain strips had grown thick with grasses and wildflowers. Cutting hay required scythes sharpened carefully along whetstones carried at the belt. Edwin moved in steady arcs, blade gliding through stems in rhythmic sweeps. Other men followed similar patterns, forming rows that would later be gathered into windrows for drying. Dry weather during haymaking was essential. Rain could spoil cut grass, reducing fodder quality and risking mold. The sky remained clear for several crucial days. The hay dried evenly under sun and light breeze. Agnes and other women turned it with wooden forks to ensure uniform exposure. Children assisted in bundling once moisture content felt correct. Hay was then loaded onto carts and transported to barns for winter storage. Each bundle represented security months ahead. The memory of near starvation sharpened awareness of quantity. This year, haystacks rose higher than the previous summers, aided by favorable weather. Grain heads began filling by mid-July. Barley shifted from green to pale gold. Oats followed with silvery tips that caught sunlight. Rye thickened along upper ridges. The fields no longer signaled mere survival. They suggested abundance if weather held steady. Yet risk persisted. Thunderstorms rolled across distant horizons on several afternoons. Dark clouds gathered quickly, releasing brief but heavy rain. Edwin and the Reeve inspected drainage channels cut during spring. Water flowed between ridges rather than pooling atop them. The adjustments made last year's disaster proved effective. Inside the cottage, Agnes resumed fuller bread baking using small amounts of last year's emergency seed grain, now safe to consume as the new crop approached maturity. The bread was still coarse, but thicker during the lean months. Butter production increased as cows grazed richly. Cheese rounds were formed and set to age in cool corners of the cottage. Trade slowly resumed with greater frequency. A traveling merchant arrived carrying iron sickle blades and coarse cloth from a nearby town. Edwin bartered a small cheese wheel for a new sickle blade in preparation for harvest. Metal tools were costly but essential. A dull blade during harvest could waste precious grain. By early August, harvest began in earnest. Timing required coordination across the manor. Sir Geoffrey's steward announced the start, and each household turned to its assigned strips. Cutting grain demanded careful handling to prevent shattering ripe heads. Sickle blades moved in short, controlled arcs, gathering stalks into tight bundles tied with straw bands. Work extended from sunrise until fading light. Even children assisted in gathering and stacking sheaves upright in small shocks, to dry before transport. The pace was relentless but structured. Meals were carried to the field. Bread, cheese, and diluted ale brewed lightly from leftover grain. Ale served as safer hydration than stagnant water and provided small caloric support. As sheaves dried sufficiently, ox-drawn carts transported them to the manor's threshing barn. There, grain would later be separated from stalk using flails during autumn and winter. For now, protection from rain remained priority. The yield exceeded cautious expectations. Barley heads were full, oats plentiful, rye steady though slightly thinner than ideal. The previous year's failure had not repeated. Inside Frost Hollow, a quiet recalibration occurred. The memory of winter's coldest nights remained vivid, but now it was balanced by tangible abundance. Grain filled storage bins gradually. Agnes measured each addition with practiced attention, separating seed for next year immediately before calculating household share. The Lord's portion was collected as rent in kind. Though significant, it did not strip the villagers to scarcity. Sir Geoffrey, mindful of the famine's recent toll, maintained moderate demands. His own stores had suffered the previous year. Recovery benefited both manor and tenant. Threshing began in late August for early barley. Inside the barn, flails rose and fell in steady rhythm, striking sheaves to loosen grain. Dust filled the air. The process required coordination to avoid injury. After threshing, grain was winnowed using shallow baskets tossed gently to allow chaff to separate in light breeze. Agnes inspected the first sack of cleaned barley poured into their storage chest. The sound of kernels striking wood echoed differently than during winter's hollow counting. This was a sound of accumulation rather than depletion. Autumn vegetables were planted promptly, turnips and cabbages seeded for storage later in the year. The lessons of famine sharpened planning. No delay was acceptable. As September approached, nights cooled slightly, but the air held no threat. Firewood gathering resumed with intention rather than desperation. This time, wood was stacked higher and covered more carefully to protect from moisture. Peat cutting from nearby marshland was increased to supplement timber. Livestock, strengthened by summer pasture, entered autumn in healthier condition than the previous year. Calves matured steadily. Milk production stabilized. Cheese rounds aged along rafters. Inside the cottage, sleeping arrangements remained spread apart, no longer clustered tightly for warmth. The hearth burned less intensely. Smoke rose in thin columns through clearer skies. The village that had endured frozen silence now moved with steady productivity. Each activity carried imprint of winter's hardship. Deeper drainage ditches, expanded haystacks, more cautious seed separation, reinforced barn walls, additional straw reserves. As harvest concluded and grain stores filled, Frost Hollow prepared once more for the cycle's return. Winter would come again, as it always did, but the experience of surviving the coldest nights had reshaped practice and perspective. They understood now more clearly that survival was not anchored in a single season. It was an accumulation of disciplined acts, stretching from thaw to frost, from seed to sheaf, from ember to sunrise. The weight of summer had been carried successfully. The memory of hunger had not vanished, but it had been answered, this time with full barns in strengthened resolve. And as the first cool wind of approaching autumn brushed across the ripened fields, Frost Hollow stood prepared to face the turning year once more, fortified by both knowledge and grain.
By late September, the fields around Frost Hollow had been stripped of standing grain. What remained were low stubble rows stretching across the ridges, pale beneath a sky that had begun to fade earlier each evening. The intensity of harvest gave way to a different urgency: preservation. Grain-filled sacks inside the manor barn and within each cottage's storage chest. But harvest alone did not guarantee survival. What mattered now was how well the sun captured in those kernels could be protected from damp, vermin, mold, and theft. Inside Edwin's cottage, Agnes oversaw the careful transfer of cleaned barley into a raised wooden bin lined with tightly woven straw matting. Elevating grain above the earth floor reduced moisture exposure. She scattered dried bay leaves and mint among upper layers, a common practice believed to deter insects. Whether fully effective or not, the ritual persisted through generations. Thomas assisted by checking the lids fit. Even small gaps could allow mice to enter. Rodents were relentless in autumn, drawn by scent of fresh stores. Simple wooden traps were set along walls, baited with crumbs. Cats, semi-wild and lean, moved through the village freely, tolerated and encouraged for their hunting skill. Outside, the threshing continued for oats and rye. Flails struck rhythmically inside the barn. Dust coated hair and clothing. Work did not slow simply because grain was secured. It shifted toward processing. Sir Geoffrey's steward tallied dues as tenants delivered the lord's share. This year's yield allowed payments without stripping households dangerously thin. The steward recorded measures in a wax tablet before transferring them into parchment records kept at the manor. Literacy rested largely in clerical hands, but its presence shaped economic order. Autumn plowing began soon after harvest. Strips designated for winter wheat required turning while soil retained residual warmth. Edwin and other plowmen guided oxen across fields once more, cutting furrows that would rest beneath winter frost before spring germination. This second cycle of plowing completed the agricultural year's core rhythm. Agnes shifted focus toward preserving vegetables. Cabbages harvested from late summer plantings were layered in salt within clay crocks to ferment slowly. Turnips were lifted and sorted. Damaged ones consumed immediately, while firm specimens were placed into newly prepared clamps insulated with straw and soil. Onions were braided and hung from rafters to dry. Fuel gathering intensified. The forest edge near Frost Hollow showed signs of repeated cutting from previous winters. Fallen branches were collected methodically. Edwin and Thomas worked together to split thicker logs using iron wedges borrowed cooperatively among households. Each split piece was stacked under a simple lean-to structure to keep rain off. Peat blocks cut during summer when marshes were accessible were transported now while ground remained firm. Peat provided slow-burning heat ideal for banking embers overnight. Its smoke was heavy, but in deep winter its endurance outweighed discomfort. Livestock slaughter occurred again in November as cold approached. Animals unlikely to survive winter feed demands were selected carefully. The process was efficient and deliberate. Meat was salted heavily in wooden tubs and hung near the hearth to smoke lightly. Fat was rendered into tallow for candles and cooking. Nothing was wasted. Hides were scraped and stretched for later use. The memory of the previous winter shaped these preparations. Hay stores were inspected repeatedly. Barn walls were reinforced with additional straw packing. Gaps in cottage walls were sealed early rather than waiting for first frost. The roof thatch was checked for thin patches and repaired where needed. Inside the cottage, bedding straw was replaced fully before cold returned. Agnes layered it thickly beneath linen sacks. Wool blankets were aired and mended. The children gathered dried bracken to supplement insulation along the interior wall where wind had penetrated most fiercely the year before. By late October, nights cooled sharply. Frost appeared along field edges once more, though not yet severe. The first fire of autumn was lit earlier in the evening. Smoke drifted upward, thinner than during famine winter, but familiar. Edwin stood one evening beside the grain bin, running his hand through the top layer. The abundance felt solid, tangible. There would be hardship again. Winter never arrived gently, but this year the margin between hunger and endurance was wider. The village well was cleaned before freezing weather returned. Buckets and rope were inspected for weakness. Ice would soon form again across its surface, and access must remain reliable. The parish priest marked All Saints' Day with solemn observance. The church interior smelled faintly of damp wood and candle wax. Prayers were offered not only for souls, but for continued protection over the coming winter. Ritual and routine bound the community's sense of order to the turning of seasons. By mid-November, frost deepened. Grass stiffened in the morning. Breath formed clouds once more in early light. Livestock were moved gradually into closer quarters. Cows occupied the byre attached to Edwin's cottage again, separated by wooden boards yet sharing warmth through thin barriers. The family's sleeping arrangement tightened as temperatures dropped, not from desperation this time, but from prudence. Shared warmth conserved fuel and strengthened comfort. The hearth was managed with steady confidence. Ash banking had become instinctive. Wind returned across the open fields, now empty except for winter wheat just beginning to root beneath soil. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air carried its promise. Inside, Agnes baked bread from new barley ground in the quern. The sound of stone turning felt different now, not scraping the last of dwindling grain, but shaping a stable store into nourishment. She added small amounts of dried herbs to the dough, flavoring it modestly. Butter spread across fresh bread carried richness absent the year before. As the first snow of the new season finally fell, it did so gently, settling across stacked wood piles and barn roofs without urgency. Frost Hollow moved into winter again, but not as before. The coldest nights would return. Ice would seal the stream. Wind would press against daubed walls. Yet the systems that had preserved life during famine had been strengthened. Higher haystacks, fuller grain bins, reinforced structures, disciplined rationing plans already measured in advance. When Edwin banked the hearth on that first snowy evening, he did so without the quiet fear that had shadowed him the year before. The embers glowed steadily beneath ash. Agnes laid warmed stones near the children's feet, more from habit than necessity. Outside, snow covered the ridges once more, but beneath it lay winter wheat seeded in time, protected by careful plowing and drainage. Livestock shifted calmly within barns thick with straw. Grain rested secure in raised bins lined against damp. Frost Hollow had learned from the coldest nights. Survival had not depended on strength alone, nor on fortune. It had rested on architecture shaped for insulation, communal governance, agricultural timing, seed preservation, livestock integration, diversified food sources, and disciplined preparation extending across every season.
The second winter after the famine did not announce itself with violence. It arrived steadily, building layer upon layer of frost across the fields of Frost Hollow. By early December, the ridges were white again, the stream sealed beneath clear ice, and the forest edge stiff with frozen branches. Yet the mood within the village differed from the year before. Preparation had been deliberate. Stores were measured, systems were tested. Inside Edwin's cottage, the grain bin stood nearly full, its lid secured tightly each night. Agnes had already calculated weekly consumption rates extending into late spring. Unlike the previous winter, there was margin, not abundance beyond caution, but sufficient depth to endure without immediate fear. The hearth burned with steadier confidence. Wood stacked beneath the lean-to remained dry. Peat blocks were layered near the doorway for easy access. Edwin had reinforced the smoke hole in the roof with a simple wooden collar that reduced drafts without trapping smoke excessively. Small improvements, shaped by memory, altered daily comfort significantly. Livestock were settled into winter quarters earlier than the previous year. The oxen stood on thick bedding renewed weekly. Manure accumulated deliberately and was moved to a growing midden pile near the field's edge, reserved for spring fertilization.
Cows shared the byre wall adjacent to the family's sleeping space. Their body heat created a noticeable difference in interior temperature once the door was sealed for the night. Snow fell heavily one evening in mid-December, blanketing the village in silence. The reeve organized a rotation to clear pathways between cottages before drifts hardened. Collective effort prevented isolation. Each household contributed labor, ensuring that no door was sealed shut by neglect. Inside, Agnes prepared a meal richer than any served during the famine winter. Barley bread, thick and warm, was paired with cabbage preserved in brine and a modest portion of salted pork from autumn slaughter. The children ate without restraint, though moderation remained habit. The cold intensified near the solstice. Nights stretched long, darkness settling before late afternoon and lingering past early morning. The rhythm of segmented sleep resumed naturally. Edwin rose during the midnight interval, not from anxiety but from routine, stirring embers and checking the animals. Wind swept across the open fields with familiar force, pressing against cottage walls. This time, however, the daub held firm. Additional straw packing along interior seams prevented drafts. The roof thatch, repaired thoroughly in autumn, did not sag under snow weight. Beyond Frost Hollow, reports from traders suggested that other villages were recovering unevenly. Some regions had experienced renewed crop failures, though not as catastrophic as during the Great Famine's peak. Markets operated cautiously. Grain prices stabilized, but remained higher than years before the crisis. One afternoon, a small group of travelers passed near the village boundary, heading toward the abbey. They carried tools and modest packs, likely displaced laborers seeking steadier work. Frost Hollow offered no hostility, but no invitation either. The memory of scarcity encouraged careful boundaries. Charity was practiced through measured alms, not open settlement. As Christmas approached, the parish priest organized modest celebration within the small church. Candles made from rendered tallow flickered against wooden walls. Hymns were sung softly. A shared meal followed, contributed by each household in proportion to means. This year, contributions were meaningful rather than symbolic. The coldest night of that winter came in early January. The sky cleared entirely, stars sharp and numerous above the valley. Air froze moisture instantly. Snow beneath boots sounded brittle and hollow. Breath crystallized in thick clouds. Inside the cottage, Edwin and Agnes prepared deliberately. The fire was banked deeply with peat and ash. Warmed stones were placed at bedding edges. Grain for the next morning's meal was measured before sleep to avoid extended exposure to cold air at dawn. The children lay between their parents beneath layered wool blankets. The byre wall radiated steady warmth from cattle beyond. Smoke drifted slowly upward through the roof opening, thinner due to reduced fuel use, but sufficient. Midnight passed in silence, broken only by shifting animals and occasional crack of contracting timber. The temperature dropped further. Frost traced patterns along the shutter once more, though thinner than the year before. Edwin rose briefly, stepping outside to assess conditions. Snow glittered under starlight. No wind moved. The village stood intact, roofs heavy but stable, woodpiles covered, barns secure. He returned inside without urgency. The embers glowed red beneath ash, preserved exactly intended. He added a single small log, not from necessity but from caution, and lay down again. Morning arrived cold but manageable. No animal had perished, no roof had collapsed. The well was frozen at the surface, yet easily broken through with tools prepared in advance. Daily routines continued through January and February. Grain consumption remained steady with no drastic reductions required. Agnes introduced small variations to meals: dried apples saved from autumn, thicker pottage when particularly cold days demanded additional strength. Thomas, now older and stronger, assisted in splitting additional wood during milder afternoons. Aylin learned spinning with greater precision, producing thread that Agnes planned to trade in spring. Winter wheat planted in autumn lay dormant beneath snow, insulated by its cover. This protective layer, once feared as barrier, was now recognized as shield against deeper frost penetration.
As February progressed, sunlight lingered slightly longer each day. Icicles formed and melted intermittently. The cycle felt familiar but less threatening. The systems developed during the famine year proved durable. Disciplined storage, reinforced architecture, communal coordination, diversified preservation, livestock integration, and seasonal planning extended beyond single crisis into sustained practice. By late February, minor thaw began again. Snow softened at midday. The stream beneath ice groaned faintly as water pressed forward. Inside the cottage, Agnes opened the grain bin to measure remaining stores. The level had lowered, but not alarmingly. Seed grain remained untouched and secure. There would be no desperate calculation this year. Edwin stood at the doorway one evening as meltwater dripped from the thatch. He observed the ridges re-emerging beneath thinning snow. Beneath them, winter wheat roots remained alive. The second winter had tested Frost Hollow again, though not with the same severity of famine. The coldest nights had returned, but they met a village strengthened by memory and preparation. Survival had shifted from reactive endurance to proactive stability. The lessons carved by ice and hunger had reshaped daily life permanently.
By the time the second winter began to loosen its hold, Frost Hollow no longer measured the season in fear or uncertainty. It measured it in systems. The cold had become a known force, demanding, exacting, but predictable when met with preparation layered across the year. In early March, as thaw returned once more, the village moved into spring without the desperation that had defined the famine year. Grain remained in storage. Seed sacks were intact and dry. Livestock had survived in strong condition. Woodpiles, though reduced, had not been exhausted. The open fields emerged from snow in stages. Winter wheat planted in autumn showed steady green across ridges. Its early growth gave the village visible assurance weeks before barley and oats would be sown again. Edwin inspected the strips with careful attention, noting where meltwater collected and where drainage held firm. Adjustments made the previous year had improved the land's resilience. Plowing for spring crops began on schedule. Oxen moved with confident rhythm, their hooves sinking into softened earth without strain. The moldboard plow cut clean furrows through soil that had benefited from proper autumn turning and winter freeze. The repeated cycle of freeze and thaw had broken heavy clods into workable texture, improving tilth naturally. Agnes measured seed grain without the tight calculation that once defined her winter evenings. There was no temptation to reduce planting in order to preserve food. The balance between consumption and investment felt stable. As sowing progressed, Thomas walked beside his father, scattering barley in controlled arcs learned through observation over years. Elin followed with light rakes, covering exposed seed where birds might gather. Their movements reflected continuity, skills transferred seamlessly across seasons shaped by hardship. Spring greens returned quickly. Nettles, wild garlic, and young dandelion leaves supplemented meals before grain harvest. Cows produced more milk as pasture thickened. Butter and soft cheese became common again at the table. The thin broths of famine winter were replaced by fuller stews thickened with grain and early vegetables. Within the cottage, the hearth remained central but less dominant. Smoke no longer defined interior air. Windows were opened during daylight, allowing sunlight to warm packed earth floors. Bedding was aired outside to remove damp gathered during winter months. Repair work expanded beyond necessity into improvement. Edwin added a small wooden shutter reinforcement to reduce wind penetration in future storms. Agnes reorganized storage bins, separating seed reserves into smaller containers to reduce risk of entire loss if vermin breached one. Summer approached with steady warmth rather than sudden heat. Crops rose evenly across fields. No prolonged rains threatened rot. Hay meadows flourished once more. The rhythm of cutting, drying, and stacking repeated with practiced efficiency. The village well, cleaned thoroughly before winter, provided clear water without freezing complications. The stream flowed steadily. Trade routes reopened fully, and merchants reported gradual regional recovery from famine's peak years. By midsummer, Frost Hollow stood in stronger condition than it had before the Great Famine began. Not because abundance had become extravagant, but because discipline had deepened. The memory of the coldest nights persisted in daily habit. Wood was stacked earlier and higher. Seed was separated immediately after threshing without hesitation. Drainage channels were inspected monthly. Livestock health was monitored with greater scrutiny. Communal watch rotations were formalized during extreme weather, no longer improvised. Autumn returned once again, and with it, harvest. The yield matched or slightly exceeded the previous year's recovery. Barley heads were full, oats steady, rye reliable. Hay stores rose high within barns. Turnips and cabbages were preserved methodically. Salted pork hung from beams in sufficient quantity. When the third winter after famine approached, Frost Hollow met it with quiet mastery. Snow fell in December as it always had. Wind pressed against daubed walls. The stream froze once more. But inside cottages, warmth was layered intentionally. Thick thatch above, reinforced wattle and daub walls, animals sharing structural heat, straw renewed beneath bedding, embers banked skillfully each night. On the coldest evening of that winter, when air sharpened so intensely that breath crystallized instantly, Edwin followed the same sequence refined through years of trial. He stacked peat beneath seasoned wood, arranged ash over coals, secured the door latch, checked the byre partition, and laid warmed stones near the children's feet. Agnes measured the following day's grain and sealed the storage lid. No anxiety accompanied the act, only routine. The children, now stronger and accustomed to winter rhythms, slept steadily. The oxen shifted softly in straw. Smoke drifted upward through the roof opening, guided by improved draft control. Outside, frost coated the fields beneath starlight. Beneath snow lay winter wheat, insulated and secure. Beneath the village roofs lay grain captured from summer sun and preserved through discipline. The coldest nights no longer represented a singular crisis. They were integrated into the structure of life itself. Across medieval Europe, countless villages faced winters with varying success. Some were undone by flood, disease, or war. Others survived through systems similar to those practiced in Frost Hollow. Communal labor, diversified food sources, architectural adaptation, livestock integration, precise seasonal timing, and unbroken knowledge passed orally across generations. Winter did not soften. It did not shorten significantly, but understanding of it deepened. As midnight passed on that coldest night, Edwin arose once more during the interval between sleeps. He stirred the embers lightly, ensuring their glow would endure until dawn. He listened to the wind against the walls, strong but contained. He stepped outside briefly. Snow reflected starlight across the valley. The village stood intact, roofs steady beneath white cover, smoke faint against dark sky. He returned inside without urgency. The mastery of winter was not victory over cold. It was coexistence shaped by preparation. It was grain stored properly, walls sealed in autumn, hay cut in time, seed protected, animals sheltered, fire banked with precision. Morning would come slowly, as always. Frost would require breaking through thin ice, but breakfast would be served from full stores. The oxen would breathe warm air into the byre. The children would rise to tasks defined by season rather than crisis. The story of how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights was never about a single dramatic event. It was about continuity, the layering of knowledge across years, the discipline to prepare during abundance, and the acceptance that winter's return was certain but manageable. And in Frost Hollow, beneath that quiet winter sky, survival had become not merely endurance, but structure, built carefully, season by season, until even the longest, coldest nights could be met without fear, only with readiness.
Years passed in Frost Hollow, and winter continued its steady return, as constant as sunrise and harvest.
The Great Famine faded from immediate memory, though its imprint remained embedded in habits, architecture, and conversation. Children who had once gathered nettles during lean months grew into adults who now instructed others on how to prepare before scarcity ever threatened. Thomas reached manhood during a cycle of stable harvests. He took on greater responsibility in the open fields, guiding oxen with the same measured voice once used by Edwin. His hands, hardened by years of labor, understood soil texture instinctively. He recognized when moisture was balanced and when furrows needed adjusting to prevent pooling. Ellen mastered spinning and weaving with precision. Wool production, once a modest winter occupation, expanded slightly as regional trade stabilized. Merchants passed more regularly along routes connecting inland villages to market towns. Small exchanges of cloth for iron tools or salt strengthened Frost Hollow's position within the broader medieval economy. Edwin and Agnes grew older, their pace slowing but their presence steady. They no longer rose before dawn every day, yet their knowledge remained central. When autumn arrived, it was Edwin who inspected the grain bins for structural weakness. It was Agnes who measured seed and ensured that separate sacks were sealed against damp. The village itself matured. New cottages were constructed on the edge of the clearing as families expanded. Each structure followed principles refined during famine years. Thick thatch layered carefully, walls sealed tightly before first frost, livestock integrated into adjacent byres to share warmth. No new house was built without consideration of winter's demands. Drainage channels cut after the famine were maintained annually. Spring inspections became ritualized. Men and older boys walked field boundaries with tools in hand, clearing obstructions before sowing began. The lessons learned when water drowned crops had not been forgotten. One winter, heavier snowfall than others brought. Drifts rose nearly to window height along certain cottages, but pathways were cleared quickly, coordinated through the Reeves' direction. Wood piles, stacked high in autumn, sustained hearths through prolonged cold. No household exhausted fuel before thaw. Another year, ice formed thick enough on the stream to support cart passage temporarily. The village adapted routes without hesitation, using frozen surfaces strategically while monitoring for cracks. The sound of splitting ice remained familiar, but no longer alarming. During one particularly severe January, when wind drove snow horizontally across the valley for days without pause, Frost Hollow activated its winter watch fully. Rotations were established to check vulnerable roofs, assist elderly residents with fire tending, and inspect livestock barns twice nightly. Cooperation replaced isolation. Inside cottages, segmented sleep continued as a natural rhythm. Families rose during the midnight interval to stir embers, check animals, and sometimes share quiet conversation. These hours, once associated with anxiety during famine, now felt structured and expected. The church calendar continued to anchor time. Advent signaled preparation not only for spiritual observance but for physical readiness. Candlemas reminded villagers that light would return. Rogation processions in spring reinforced shared responsibility over crops. Beyond Frost Hollow, political changes unfolded. Kings shifted, conflicts flared in distant counties, taxes were levied and adjusted. Yet within the village, the primary measure of stability remained agricultural continuity and winter endurance. As Edwin aged further, Thomas assumed full oversight of the household. He expanded the wood shelter to protect more fuel from rain. He introduced a simple internal partition that reduced heat loss from the main room to the entry space. Small architectural refinements accumulated over time, each contributing incremental resilience. Agnes taught Ellen how to judge when cabbage fermentation was complete, how to layer turnips within clamps for maximum insulation, how to rotate stored grain to prevent spoilage. These instructions were precise and repeated until instinctive. Children born after the famine heard stories of the winter when grain nearly vanished and strangers came seeking food. The narrative was delivered without drama, focused instead on the practices that ensured survival. Preserving seed, reinforcing walls, sharing watch duties, respecting the limits of stores. One winter, a neighboring village suffered livestock illness that spread quickly through poorly ventilated barns. Frost Hollow avoided similar loss because of improvements made to airflow and byres during earlier winters. Experience had reshaped structure. Another year, late spring frost threatened newly sprouted barley. Thomas and others responded by covering vulnerable strips with light brush where possible and adjusting planting times the following season. Adaptation remained constant. The cycle of sowing, harvesting, storing, and enduring repeated steadily. Winter nights remained long and cold, but never again did they bring the sharp edge of famine panic. The margin built through discipline endured. Edwin eventually passed during a mild autumn, his life spanning both famine and recovery. The village marked his burial with solemn respect. His knowledge had become communal property long before his passing. Agnes continued several more winters, seated near the hearth during the coldest evenings, instructing younger women on ash banking and fuel layering. Her hands, though aged, still measured grain with accuracy shaped by decades of practice. Thomas, now head of household, faced each winter with the same steady preparation once modeled for him. Wood stacked early, seed separated first, hay measured precisely, livestock sheltered thoroughly, drainage maintained. Snow fell again and again across the open fields of Frost Hollow, covering ridges that had been turned by 3 generations. The stream froze and thawed countless times. Frost etched patterns on shutters each January. But the coldest nights had lost their power to define the village through fear. They had become part of a mastered cycle. The story of how medieval peasants survived winter was not confined to a single dramatic year. It was written across decades, in reinforced thatch, raised grain bins, shared watch rotations, and disciplined rationing practiced even during abundance. In Frost Hollow, winter remained demanding, but it no longer threatened collapse. It was integrated into the rhythm of life as surely as harvest and sowing.